right. Glad you guys are here today. We are in chapter 11 of the story. Has been, for me, I hope for each of you, this has been a really, really fun series to go through. One of the things that I really like about the way God wired my brain is that I'm very big picture by nature. I tend to just see the big picture in things. I don't tend to get down into the weeds, for better or worse. But one of the things that I like about that is that when it comes to the Bible, I kind of have always been able to see this bigger picture thing. But man, it has been so fun for me going through this series because even though I'm wired pretty hard this way and I've looked at the Bible this way for a long time, I'm learning so much. And I hope that you guys are as well. Today, I think is going to be an especially fun week because there's a big shift that happens this week. Now, we are, if maybe you might be joining us online today and might not be aware of what we're doing here. And so we're in a series right now called The Rise of a Nation. But this series is one smaller series in a much larger series as we walk through the one big story of the Bible. And so we're going to pull up our timeline real quickly and just kind of get everybody acclimated. This is where we've been. This is our 11th week in the series. We started out in week 1 at creation, the fall, the flood. We spent week 2 was Abraham. Week 3 was Joseph. We spent 3 weeks on Moses. We spent a week on Joshua. And then we spent a couple weeks in between Joshua and Saul, David, and Solomon. Chapters 8 and 9 were in the books of Judges and Ruth in the Bible. They aren't reflected up here, but there's an important shift that starts to happen this week as we start to look at the next 4 chapters, actually, Saul, David, and Solomon. That's going to cover chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13. 1 week on Saul, 2 on David, and 1 on Solomon. Now, what's so crucial to understand about this baseline is that the Bible is one story. There are many individual stories within it, but the Bible tells one big story. And our whole goal with this series from the very beginning to the very end, for all 31 weeks that we walk through this, is to show the one big story that the Bible tells, because it is the most incredible story, I believe, that's ever been told. And so today, what we're doing is we're looking at chapter 10. We're in this rise of a nation, and it's been an interesting rise, right? Like I called the series this, and then I sort of regretted it in the middle of the series because there's a couple weeks of the series that aren't much of a rise at all. Chapter 8 in particular, not a rise. That's a big fall. But overall, what we see is that Israel is establishing himself as this nation, this special people. The context of what has come up to this point is so critical to understand the shift that is about to take place. And so again, I just want to remind you from the beginning, what we see in the Bible is that God had a vision, he had a plan, he had a desire to be with us. We humans, we were the pinnacle of his creation. But then we fell. And when we did, we broke that relationship with God. And God then implemented a rescue plan to get us back. And from Genesis in the Bible, Genesis chapter 12 until right now, we've seen that plan unfolding. God wants to create this special nation, this special group of people. He wants to make them different, that's crucial, different than the rest of the world. Because what he ultimately wants is he wants this people group, this nation, to be his representation in the world so that the whole world would know who he is. But they don't get it right very much. They get it wrong a lot. And eventually, as things unfold, eventually God leads them to the promised land, this land that he had promised Abraham many, many years before, and they begin to establish themselves. But as they do, things don't go great. And as we looked at 2 weeks ago, there's this spiral of destruction that starts to happen. Now, I'm not going to read back through that, but I do want to remind you of what that spiral looks like, because as we enter the beginning of chapter 10, that spiral is still happening. So the spiral looks something like this. The first step in it is that Israel forgets about God. Sometimes the Bible says they forsake him. They turn away from him. And as they do, it makes God angry. Because God has done a lot of incredible things for Israel. He has proven his faithfulness to them, and they just forget about him over and over and over. They turn away from him over. And finally, God's like, okay, listen, Here's the deal. If you're gonna turn away from me, then I'm gonna remove my protection from you. And that might seem harsh to us, but the reality is this is no different than saying to a kid who does a stupid thing, okay, you're gonna have to face the consequences of your choices. If you're gonna do dumb stuff, I'm not gonna shield you from the consequences. It's the same thing, okay? So this might feel harsh, but it is God saying, listen, I've been protecting you, but I'm not going to any longer because you need to understand and learn that your consequences, there are repercussions to those. Not because I'm punishing you per se, but because like the way that I've told you to live is the right way. If you're not gonna do it, things aren't gonna work out very well. And so Israel turns away from God, and then God removes his protection from them. And what happens then is like raiders will come in and they'll pillage the people, or a neighboring army will come in and they'll win some victories against Israel, and things just aren't very good. And this image of Israel being this strong, firm nation, it's not really happening. And eventually God will relent. The way that Judges describes it is that God hears the groaning of his people. They're just. And God sees that and he hears it and he relents. And so God will raise up a judge. So step 1, Israel turns away. Step 2, God removes his protection. Step 3, God raises up a judge out of his compassion and mercy for his people. And when he raises up that judge, he is with that judge for the judge's life, and he protects Israel through that judge. But then, when the judge dies, Israel turns away from God again. And the whole cycle just starts. And it's so destructive. And as chapter 10 opens, we're introduced, or we're inserted right into the middle of this cycle. Now, to be fair, the very first couple chapters of the Bible in the book of 1 Samuel, which is where chapter 10 is from, they don't actually tell that part. They introduce us to a family. But introducing us to the family is the way of kind of easing into it. They introduce us to a family, and this family is kind of a unique family. There's a woman who desperately wants to become pregnant, but she hasn't been able to, and she cries out to God over and over and over, and she eventually says to God, if you will give me a son, I will give him back to you. I will send him to the temple at Shiloh, where he will serve you all the days of his life. And God allows her to conceive, and she gives birth to a son named Samuel. And Hannah is faithful to her word, and she gives Samuel back to God. She literally, once he's old enough, she gives him to a man named Eli, who is the high priest for Israel at the time. Now, what you might, if you read chapter 10, what you might have recognized was this priestly kind of a role. What you might not have understood about it, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, is that the high priest was a judge. Eli is a judge. So as we walked through the book of Judges a couple weeks ago and talked about these wicked judges, Eli was a judge. In fact, I went in and Chris and I did a deep dive into some of the Hebrew in this part, and there's some really interesting things that happen here. But in the beginning part of 1 Samuel, every time you see like that Eli was the leader of Israel, or eventually that Samuel was the leader of Israel, the word leader is the same word used to describe the judges. They were judges. They were judges. So we're inserted straight into this same exact scenario. And what's really interesting about it is we see the spiral at play. In fact, I initially had all these verses in, but oh my goodness, I had so many verses. So you can look into this yourself if you want, but we see the same cycle taking place. Israel forsaking God. Eli has these two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. They're terrible dudes. They're awful. In fact, they're so wicked that Israel comes to Eli and is like, hey, your sons are terrible people, because Eli has turned over his priestly roles to Hophni and Phinehas. And Israel comes to him and says, your sons are awful guys. So Eli goes and confronts them about it. And some of the stuff the guys were doing, terrible. Now, it doesn't directly say that Israel has forsaken the Lord, but if Israel's highest spiritual authorities have forsaken the Lord, probably safe to say Israel's not far behind, all right? So Israel forsakes God, and then there is a direct example of God turning his hand against Israel. The Philistines come in and they invade, and there's actually this moment where they lose this battle to the Philistines, and the leaders of the army come together and they're like, why did God turn his hand against us? So Israel forsakes God. God turns against Israel. And then God raises up a judge, Samuel. the young boy we're introduced to at the beginning. At this point, he's older. He's demonstrated faithfulness to God, and God raises him up as a judge over Israel. And then it literally says, and the Lord was with Samuel all of his life and protected Israel from all of their enemies as long as Samuel lived. It's the same pattern. We're introduced directly to it in Judges. It's the same pattern here. But this time with Samuel, something different happens. Instead of cycling back around and Israel forsaking God, at least in the normal way, something changes. And it's that something that changes that opens up this whole new section of the Bible. 1 Samuel chapter 8, starting in verse 1. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of the firstborn was Joel. The name of the second was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes, and they perverted justice. I'm going to kind of give some comments throughout today. Keep in mind, Samuel's a judge. Samuel has appointed his sons to now be judges. The job of a judge is to do justice. That is the job. It is in the name. They are to judge right from wrong, help settle disputes. Critically for Israel, they're supposed to be handing out justice according to what God says. These guys, not so much. They're doing evil. Interestingly, this is almost a direct parallel to the way that Eli's sons are described. Eli has two sons. They're wicked. Eli confronts them, they don't change. Samuel has two sons. He appoints them as judges. They do evil. This time, though, instead of Israel coming and saying, hey, you need to get your sons in line, they say something completely different. So as it continues, all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, you are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Now, appoint us a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. This is the first moment in this cycle, in this destruction of Israel. It's the first time that we see Israel going, something needs to change. We need something to be different here. And critically, what they ask for is a king. Now, at this moment, this may not seem like a huge deal. And without giving too much away of where we're going, for the next several hundred years, Israel had kings leading it. This is a critical moment in the history of the nation of Israel. They say, give us a king. We want a king. Something has to change. We want a king. But Samuel's response isn't great. Samuel is displeased by this request, which makes sense. He was the primary leader of Israel at this point. He's displeased, so he prays. And when he does, God says something very, very interesting. The Lord told him, listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you that they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. So listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. So God says, listen, give them what they want. And by the way, this is often the way God deals with us in our own lives. We want something that we don't really understand the implications or consequences of, and so often God's like, all right, okay, if that's what you want. The line where God says they have rejected me as their king, it's not you that they've rejected, it's me that they've rejected, is so important. See, up to this point, God has not explicitly said it this way, but God's desire all along was, again, that Israel would be different. They would be set apart. He talks about them being a holy nation. That word holy is important. All it means is set apart for the use of God alone. That's what you can, like, if you grew up in a tradition maybe that talked about holiness all the time, what that means is being set apart for God's use only. You're set apart. There's common and then there's holy. That's kind of the difference, okay? There's common and there's holy. So God says, I want you to not be common. You're not gonna live like everybody else. You're gonna be very, very different. And the reason you're gonna be different is so people will see me. But if it's gonna work, I have to be the king. I have to be the one in charge. Again, God has never said I'm the king, but that is exactly what he has set up through all of his commands. And so God's like, listen, I've been trying to get the people to see that I need to be their king. I need to be the one. Everybody else has human kings, but I need to be king over Israel. And they don't want it. So give them a human king. So Samuel repeats it to the people. He says all the words of the Lord to the people who are asking him. And Samuel gives probably the worst possible recommendation for a position that has ever happened in human history. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves, and he'll give them to his attendants. He'll take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage, which is your wine, and give it to his officials and attendants, your male and female servants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys he's going to take for his own use. He'll take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. And when that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but God isn't going to answer you. At which point, Israel should have been like, maybe no. That seems like a bad situation, right? It's so easy for us to sit here now and read that and go, well, okay. It's pretty obvious what should be done here. Clearly, Israel should not say, well, we want a king. But as Israel was so prone to do, they've got to learn the hard way. And so their response to Samuel is that they refused to listen. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then, in what is one of the most prophetic and important lines of all that we have read to this point, not today, like in the Bible to this point, they say, then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and to fight our battles. This is the first century equivalent of keeping up with the Joneses. Not first century. Jesus was first century. This was 1,000 years prior. This is the equivalent of keeping up with the Joneses. We want what they have. They have it better than us because they have a king that they can look at and who will lead them into battle. Us, I mean, we've got God, but like we can't see him. And the judges that we've had, they are a train wreck. So we want a king. We don't want these judges. These judges are not cutting it. We want a king. We want to look like the other nations. Keep in mind, God's entire plan to this point, his entire plan is dependent on Israel being different, on being set apart, on not looking like all the other nations. Because you know who gets credit when things are really good inside of a kingdom? The king. The king. Do you also know what tends to happen to humans when they start to get power? They tend to want to hold it. And they tend to do whatever they can to maintain it, no matter what it costs the people that they're supposed to be leading. And the warning that God gives is exactly that. Look, if you want a king, I'll give you a king. But that king is going to take what he wants from you, and in the end, you're going to be his slaves. And God says, I don't want that for you. I want you to be my people. I want you to be set apart. I want you to be different. But you can't be different if you're just like everyone else. No, but if we just had that car, if we just had that house, if we just had a little bit more space, if we just had what they have, then things would be better. So Israel knows something has to change. But unfortunately for Israel, what they fall prey to is the same thing that so often in our lives we fall prey to as well. When we come to these moments where we know that something has to change, where do we look? Where do we put our eyes? See, for a lot of us, when we know something needs to change, what we do is we look at the people around us and we go, oh, well, they're happy and they have this and this and this. And if we had this and this and this and this, we might be happy too. Oh, well, those people don't seem to be struggling as much. So if we just had what they have, then maybe we wouldn't be struggling as much either. What Israel gets wrong here, and this isn't actually the main thing that I wanted to tell you, but as we were looking through the message, it's like, this is such an important thing. It's not the main thing, but it's an important thing. So it's kind of a side note, but an important one. What we see in Israel here is that knowing change needs to happen doesn't mean the right change happens. Like, knowing that things need to change in our lives doesn't mean the right things change. What starts to change for Israel is actually one of the worst things that could have happened, that could have changed. But they jump into it wholesale. I mean, they've been warned, but they do it. Why? Because the power of looking at the people around us and saying, well, they have ... well, they ... and if I had ... if I was ... like them, then I would feel like them. That power is so enticing and has been so enticing for the entire history of humanity. Because we can't see God. Israel had all the evidence they needed at this point that God was going to do exactly what he said, that he was going to provide, that he was going to be abundant, that he was going to bless them abundantly, that he was going to do these incredible things. But what Israel did was they stepped back from it and they went, well, yeah, he did all those other things in the past, but right now we need peace. We need to not be at war with everyone. We need people to not be coming against us, and these judges aren't cutting it, so we need what they have because what they have works. And we do the same thing in a million ways in our own lives. Instead of simply trusting, but God has said he will protect us. But God has said he will care for us. But God has said he will provide for us. But God has said he will bless for us. And if he will bless us, and if God says it, then we can trust it because God has demonstrated time and time and time and time again that when he says it, that is the end. It is true and it is good. Now, again, that's not actually what I wanted to tell you today. That's just a side note, but it's an important one. It's a really important one. Because see, at the end of the day, if Israel actually trusted that God was a better king than a human king, then they wouldn't have ever looked to human kings. But they do. And so from here, the whole narrative shifts. We enter the reign of the kings. As we do, God speaks to Samuel and he says, hey, there's this guy. He's the one I've picked. I want you to go and you're going to find him along this road. And Samuel goes and prophesies to him and says, hey, God's going to make you king of Israel. And he's kind of like, me? Why me? But some pretty cool things happen. And then Samuel initiates a coronation. He calls the tribe that Saul belongs to, and he's like, hey, the king's from, it's kind of this dramatic moment. It's like, the king's from this tribe, and he's from this clan, and he's going through, and finally he gets to it, and he says that it's going to be Saul, and everybody looks around for Saul, and they can't find him. Which is odd, because Saul is supposed to be he's a head taller than everybody else. They can't find him. And they're like, where is he? He's hiding behind some boxes. As every king does. He's hiding. It's interesting, because at this moment in time, it seems like Saul is humble. He's like, no, but I don't deserve that. Now, as a bit of a giveaway, I don't think that's what's happening, but it's the way it looks. And so Saul's beginnings are very odd. So they find him behind the boxes, and he's like, oh yeah, here, I'm here. And Samuel anoints him king over Israel, and Saul takes command. And he starts to settle into his role, and he wins some military victories, and things are pretty good. But unfortunately, things don't stay good for very long. Things begin to come undone relatively quickly. And they start to come undone for a very specific and a very important reason. So we're going to jump into 1 Samuel chapter 13. I got to tell you that a lot of what I'm going to cover here for the rest of this isn't in the storybook. I'm not entirely sure why, because for me, it is critical in understanding what's to come. But at this point in time, 1 Samuel chapter 13, the Philistines have returned. The Philistines at this point of Israel's history are their arch enemies. They've come back. There's a battle that's getting ready to happen. And as they're preparing for it, Samuel has said to Saul, hey, listen, I've got to go somewhere else and do some other thing. I need you to wait for me. God has said, wait for me. And when I get back, this other thing's going to happen, and then everything's going to turn out great. And so Saul tells his men, we got to wait for Samuel to come back. The problem is the armies are gathered, and the Philistine army is amassing more and more troops, and the Israelite army is starting to get scared. So 1 Samuel 13, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and they camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks, and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he, being Saul, he said, okay, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. These were the things Samuel was supposed to handle. Saul says, bring him to me. So Saul offered up the burnt offering. And just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, I saw that the men were scattering. I saw that you did not come at the set time, and I saw the Philistines. Like, have you seen their army? And so I thought, look, the Philistines are going to come against us. And I've not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. Samuel says, you've done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. This is kind of an odd moment for me, because I read it and I'm like, geez, like it seems like Saul meant well. It seems like he was trying to do something right. He's like, hey, the armies are gathering and they're going to come against us. And he says, I haven't sought the Lord's favor, so I need to seek the Lord's favor, so I'm going to do this thing to seek the Lord's favor. I mean, he messed up, but like he was trying, wasn't he? It's really important to understand that God sees things we don't see. God understands things that we don't understand. And in moments like this that kind of like, but what's happening here? It's important to dig a little bit deeper. God gives a little bit of a clue through Samuel here when he says that he's rejected Saul and that he's going to find a man after his own heart. Now, that's a huge point forward to where we're going to be next week. But it does a couple really important things. Number one, it sets up a compare and contrast between Saul and the next king. And I think helps us to understand the entire purpose of Saul's story all the more. Because what we see in Saul's story, what we can understand about Saul's story at this point, is that for whatever reason, Saul was not a man after God's own heart, but the one who's going to come next is a man after God's own heart. And so we can then look at those and go, okay, what does it look like to be someone after God's own heart? And what does it look like to not be some? Because we have these two people who we can look at and say, what did they do? What did they do? What's the difference? But critically, it also demonstrates to us that God was identifying something in Saul that we can't see yet in the narrative. He's identifying that there's some heart issue with Saul. There's something about what Saul did that's bigger than what Saul did. Does that make sense? Like there's something going on that's bigger than the action Saul took. There's something inside him that God sees and that God is rejecting. Now we can start to get an idea of what that is a couple chapters later in the Bible in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Because in 1 Samuel chapter 15, Saul disobeys God again. And when Samuel confronts him, here's what he says. Samuel said, "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, 'Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out.' Why did you not obey? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?" Pause very quickly because there's context here. God had commanded Saul, "The Amalekites, I want them gone. I want you to go destroy them. When you destroy them, you are not to take a thing. You are to destroy them." What Saul does is he goes and destroys the people but keeps the stuff, which makes Israel very wealthy. And it makes his army very wealthy, and it makes him very wealthy. And when confronted about it, notice what Saul's response is, and think if you can think of any other moments in the Bible to this point where someone has responded similarly when confronted with the sin in their life. Saul says, "But I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites, and I brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers, they took sheep and cattle from the plunder. But the best of that, it was devoted to God in order to be sacrificed to the Lord, your God, at Gilgal." It sounds a little bit to me like when Adam is confronted by God. He says, "The woman made me do it. She did it." And here we see Saul doing the same thing. I did what God said, but they didn't. But he kind of gives it away, doesn't he? Samuel's response highlights what was inside Saul's heart, not just in this moment, but I believe what was in Saul's heart 2 chapters before. Samuel replies, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrificing as much as in obeying the Lord?" Because remember, Saul just said, "We took the sheep, but we're going to sacrifice them." God said, "Kill them," but we took them to sacrifice. Samuel says, "Does the Lord delight in the burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as just in obeying him? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed or to listen is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance is like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." For the first time, Samuel calls out what's in Saul's heart. He says, "You're arrogant. You're arrogant. You were once small in your own eyes, but all this power's gone to your head. God made you who you are. You didn't make you who you are. But you think that you're something now. To the point that you're flat out disobeying what God said, making excuses and blaming other people. What is going on?" And Saul, when confronted with the depth of what's in his heart, responds very differently than he did in chapter 13. In chapter 13, he didn't really respond much at all. But here, Saul says to Samuel, "I have sinned." He got caught. "I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to him, "I'm not going to go back with you. You've rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king." See, here's the thing. Saul's story to this point demonstrates something so important, and Saul gave it away in verse 24. "I have sinned. I have violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them." What we see at this point of Saul's story is one of the most important principles in the entire Bible, and one of the most universal truths for humanity. Fear of man always leads to the disobedience of God. Fear of man always leads to disobedience of God. 100% of the time. Fear of man leads to disobedience of God. Because just like what happened with Saul, we get to this place where we see the armies mounting against us, and we see that we're in a losing position. We see that there's nothing that we can do, and we like to be in control. We like to make sure we know the outcomes. Saul is a military general, and Saul's like, we can't win this battle, so I got to do something to gain the Lord's favor. But instead of simply obeying what God said, Saul starts to freak out because his men now are running away and they're hiding. And he's like, look, if we lose any more men, we're toast. And so what does he do? He disobeys what God asked him. Instead of taking the position of saying, okay, if every man in this army abandons me, but I have the Lord, I'm okay, because the Lord won't fail me. It's funny because you think back to the book of Judges and Gideon, and God whittles Gideon's army down to a small, tiny number of people. Why? To demonstrate that he's the one with the power. Think about the Battle of Jericho, which wasn't much of a battle at all. God tells them to just march around the city and yell. Why? To demonstrate that it's not their might that will save them. All the way back through the Bible, all that God has been trying to get Israel to recognize is that, hey guys, I've got it. Would you trust me? Would you just do what I tell you? And here we have yet another person who can't understand it. The irony is that Israel tried the judges, that didn't work. Israel tried the kings, and again, spoiler alert, that's not gonna work. One of the things that's fascinating to me about the Old Testament in the Bible is that it's like this case study on how no human effort is going to yield what God wants. Because we tried everything, and none of it worked. Because what God has always been looking for is simple obedience from his people. And when we fear man in any way, there will come a day where that fear of man will drive us to disregard what God says to protect ourselves. The fear of man will drive us to disregard what God says to protect ourselves. It's what happens to Saul. It's what has happened to me 100 times over in my life. When I think about all the worst decisions that I have made, they have almost all come because I've been in a place of discomfort and I don't like it and I want to fix it because I'm afraid at the core of it. I don't like admitting that, but it's because I've been afraid. And I did some stupid thing just to try to fix it and make myself feel better. Saul wanted to feel secure. He wanted to feel safe. He wanted to feel like he was protected, and he had all the protection he ever needed. But instead of sitting in that and trusting it, he disobeyed. The fear of man will always lead to disobedience of God. Conversely, the fear of God will, well, that's David. That's chapter 11. That's next week. What you're going to see as you spend time reading this week, and what I want you to do as you read this week, is I want you to notice the differences between how David responds to difficult situations and the way that Saul responded. I want you to notice the trust and the faith that David has in God that Saul doesn't have. I want you to notice specifically, because here's the thing, I'm going to give a little bit away for next week, okay? David and Goliath, right? What's the point of the David and Goliath story? That God slays giants? Nah, that isn't the point at all. It is a point. It's not the point. You know what the point of David and Goliath is? It's that there is nothing that is bigger than God. That's similar, but it's not the same. It's not that God slays giants. It's that giants are nothing to him. And that what God is looking for from his people is not that we cower in fear. Because there is nothing in this world to be afraid of. But it's that we stand and face the biggest things, saying, the Lord is with me. and I will not be afraid. There's more next week, so come back for it. But the fear of man will always lead to disobedience of God. What does the fear of God look like? Because the fear of God is everywhere in the Bible, but it is so misunderstood. My hope is that next week, as we begin to unpack, what does the fear of the Lord actually mean? For some of us, maybe some of us that grew up in very traditional, more fundamental kind of backgrounds, maybe we can gain some freedom in what the fear of the Lord means. And maybe for those of us who have a much more free-for-all theology, let's say, it might help us buckle down a bit on understanding that the fear of God matters. Because the fear of man versus the fear of God is exactly what chapters 10 and 11 are all about. When we fear man, we disobey. When we fear God, we obey. And when we obey, the Lord is with us. He stands for us, and there is nothing that will defeat us. Let's pray.